How are you going first? If you're in a position of authority, whether you identify with the word leader or manager, director, CEO, if you're in a position of authority, how are you going first? Let me tell you what I mean. Last week, I had a really unique experience with one of the classes that I teach. I teach several classes at the college level, and this was a first year class. They're all very nervous and anxious about remote learning. And we were having a conversation about emotions in the workplace. So I asked the question, do emotions belong in the workplace? And what was really fun is I had two people immediately take the extremes, which is always, that gives me a lot to work with, right? So one person said, no, absolutely not. Emotions don't belong in the workplace. They get in the way, they distract us, they interfere with logical, objective thinking. And the other person said, absolutely, we're human beings. We can't just leave all our emotions at home when we come into the workplace, and we shouldn't. We should be emotionally connected to the work we do. So great. We have these two extremes. And then I had a few other students chime in with a little more balanced approach, right? Trying to find a happy medium so we didn't have, a world war breaking out in our virtual classroom. So I took the opportunity to tell a story. I told a story about a friend of mine named Brian who passed away from cancer. I worked with Brian for about 2 years. And about a year into our working relationship, he developed cancer and he knew it was terminal from the beginning. So I told a story about how our relationship evolved. He didn't tell everybody, but he did tell quite a few people in the workplace where he was at and what happened when we allowed the emotions of his journey to come with us into the workplace. And my question for them after I told this story was, well, what do you think? Was my experience of the workplace more rich because Brian had the vulnerability and the courage to show up and share exactly where he was at? Unanimously, of course, they said yes. And what about Brian's experience? Was his experience of the workplace more rich because he decided to get vulnerable and share and bring his emotional journey into the workplace? Yeah, it was. What about all the other people that Brian interacted with and shared his story with? Absolutely. So the question becomes, is there a place for emotions in the workplace? Now, what happened next is the part that was really fascinating for me. I had a student chime in and he said, initially I agreed with the no. That person has a military background and I also have a military background. And I can see how emotions can take us off mission really quickly. But here's the thing. And he proceeded to tell a story about how he had come alongside a soldier when he was in the military who just looked like he was having a bad day. And he came alongside him and came up and said, how are you? You don't quite look like yourself today. And this person confessed and started talking about how he was thinking of taking his own life. So I have a student, a first-year student, in a virtual, remote environment. Honestly, I can't see any faces. All I see is little white boxes with little black names in WebEx, who's sharing this really rich story about what happens when we choose to acknowledge the emotions that show up in our workplaces. As leaders, we don't get to decide, right? We don't get to decide if other people bring their emotions in, but we do get to decide how we respond. So not only, of course, is there a huge lesson in this in terms of connecting with people and acknowledging, especially with all the challenges around mental health. Add to that all the challenges of a pandemic and working in a remote environment, right? Tuning in to where people are at, there's such a lesson in that. The bigger lesson here that I want to reinforce is, how are you going first? Not intentional on my part. I accidentally stumbled into this wonderful conversation. I wasn't intending to trigger something like that. I was just trying to give them for instance, a specific example that we could use to talk about emotions in the workplace. And this led to, all of a sudden, my students are having this beautiful conversation. Honestly, I'm just getting out of the way. I just sat there and let them go. And 4 or 5 and 6 of them are debating and talking through what are the choices we have to make as leaders, because they all aspire to become managers in their future role. So my question for you is, how are you going first today? When we choose to go first, we create a space for people to show up honestly, with transparency, human. We give people permission to bring their humanity into these conversations, and then we all learn something. So as leaders, as people in positions of authorities, as managers, when we choose to go first, we do such a service to our teams. And the ripple effect, the side effect of that is the blessing, is the richness that we then get to experience. That class was just the highlight of my week, watching these students engage in a conversation that frankly they wouldn't have otherwise engaged in. So I got to be a part of that, and I got to hear some tremendous stories from these students. So how are you going first? How can you go first today, this week, in one small way that shows your team your humanity so that they can show up with theirs?